What would you do if one morning you woke up to find that a group of strangers had decided your land, your home, was no longer yours to keep? That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has worked this land for 3 generations. But one crisp autumn morning, I stood at my fence line, watching Sarah Matthews, the self-appointed queen of our newly formed HOA, march across my pasture in designer heels, waving a folder stuffed with legal documents. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of a battle that would shake our entire town. This land isn't just dirt and grass. It's the dream my grandfather, Henry Walker, built with his own 2 hands when he bought it in 1947 after coming home from the war. He spent years digging fence posts from dawn to dusk, turning raw earth into something real, something lasting. My father, Thomas Walker Sr., grew up here, just like I did. He taught me everything: how to care for the livestock, how to respect the land, and most importantly, how to stand my ground. For decades, we lived in peace alongside a handful of other farming families. We helped each other through tough seasons, celebrated each other's harvests, and never once imagined that one day we'd be told we no longer belonged here. Then everything changed. 2 years ago, luxury developments started creeping in, million-dollar homes with manicured lawns, right on the edge of farmland that had been here for generations. At first, I tried to be neighborly. I even invited the newcomers to our annual harvest barbecue, hoping they'd see the beauty in farm life. Some did. Others, like Sarah Matthews, saw something else entirely. She didn't see a legacy. She saw a nuisance. An eyesore. An obstacle standing in the way of her vision for the community. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a letter. A certified notice from the HOA slipped into my mailbox as if it were just another piece of junk mail. Inside, in crisp, impersonal legalese, it ordered me to remove my cows because they were lowering property values. I almost laughed when I read it. My family had been here long before those sprawling cookie-cutter houses, before Sarah and her HOA ever existed. But what really stopped me cold wasn't the letter, it was what my security cameras caught that night. 3 figures, sneaking along my fence line, flashlights bouncing in the dark. They weren't just looking. They were taking pictures. And if I had any doubt that something bigger was going on, it vanished right then and there. This wasn't just about cows. This was the beginning of something much worse. And I was about to find out just how far Sarah Matthews was willing to go to take everything my family had built. The next morning, just as the sun was rising over the pasture, I heard the sharp click of high heels on the gravel driveway. I knew before I even turned around who it was. Sarah Matthews, and she wasn't alone. Trailing behind her were 2 HOA board members, both dressed like they were headed to a corporate meeting instead of standing on farmland that had been here long before their cookie-cutter houses. Sarah clutched a thick folder, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against the cover. "You have 30 days to remove these cows," she announced, voice dripping with entitlement, as if she had the authority to dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own land. "They're an eyesore, and we've had multiple complaints about the noise disturbing the peace." I let her talk, watching as she smugly listed off violation after violation. My barn? An unsightly structure that lowers neighborhood aesthetics. The morning sounds of livestock? A disturbance. Even the natural smell of the pasture? Not in alignment with community standards. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. But Sarah hadn't done her homework. Because I had. I reached into my own folder, one filled with documents far older than anything she had in her hands. My grandfather had been smart enough to get our land designated as protected agricultural property in 1943. I flipped to the page that mattered, held it up so she could see the official county stamp. "This land isn't just mine," I said, meeting her glare. "It's protected. Has been for over 70 years. For the first time, Sarah's smug confidence cracked. Her lips tightened. The two board members exchanged nervous glances. Before she could stammer out a response, I heard footsteps approaching. Tom Miller, my retired judge neighbor, a man whose knowledge of county law went deeper than any HOA handbook Sarah had skimmed through. He stopped beside me, crossed his arms, and gave Sarah a slow, knowing smile. "You do realize," he said, looking at her folder, "that issuing unenforceable demands on legally protected land is a very bad look for an HOA?" Sarah's face turned red. She snapped the folder shut. "We'll be reviewing this with our legal team," she said through clenched teeth before spinning on her heels and marching back toward her car. But I knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just getting started. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was happening. I went through my security camera footage from the past month, looking for anything strange. And that's when I saw it. Every Wednesday night, like clockwork, a black SUV parked at the end of my property. At first, I thought it was just teenagers messing around. But when I zoomed in, my jaw clenched. It wasn't just any SUV. It was Sarah Matthews, and she wasn't alone. She was meeting with a man I didn't recognize, someone in an expensive suit. They stood there for nearly an hour, pointing at different areas of my land, taking notes, even snapping pictures. This wasn't just about enforcing HOA rules. This was a coordinated effort to take my land. The next morning, my suspicions were confirmed when I got a call from Bill Thompson, a farmer whose family had worked this land just as long as mine. "Ethan," he said, his voice tense, "they sent us the same letter. Same 30-day deadline." That's when I knew. This wasn't a case of a few annoyed neighbors filing complaints. The HOA was systematically targeting farmers, and worse. They were setting us up for something bigger. I spent the next few days digging deeper, talking to neighbors, checking property records, and that's when I found the first real bombshell: the complaint Sarah had been waving around. The one supposedly signed by multiple homeowners. I decided to visit Maggie Johnson, one of the residents whose name was on the list. She'd always been friendly, always bought eggs from my farm. When I showed her the letter with her signature, her face went pale. "I never signed this," she whispered, her hands trembling as she looked at the paper. "I never even heard about complaints against your farm." A pit formed in my stomach. If Maggie hadn't signed it, how many others were fake? And then, just when I thought I couldn't get any angrier, the unthinkable happened. The following morning, I went out to check on my cattle and found them sick, some barely moving, others lying on their sides, their breathing heavy. Something was wrong. I called the vet immediately, pacing in the pasture as I waited for him to arrive. When he did, he ran a few tests on the water troughs. And what he found made my blood run cold. Toxic levels of chemicals. The vet pulled me aside, his face grim. "This isn't accidental contamination," he said. "This was intentional." I felt a slow, burning rage build in my chest. Someone had poisoned my cattle. And I had a damn good idea who was behind it. I stormed over to Sarah's perfectly manicured yard later that afternoon, fists clenched at my sides. She was standing outside, chatting with some of the HOA board members like nothing had happened. When she saw me approaching, she smiled, a smirk that made my skin crawl. "Something wrong, Ethan?" she asked, her voice sweet as honey. I stared her down. My cattle were poisoned. Her expression didn't even flicker. "Oh. That's terrible. Maybe your farm just isn't fit for this neighborhood anymore." That was it. That was the moment I knew I wasn't just dealing with an overzealous HOA. I was dealing with a criminal. And I was going to bring her down. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my cattle struggling to stand, the slow rise and fall of their chests as the poisoned water ran through their systems. I saw Sarah's smug, unbothered face as she dismissed it like it was nothing, like my farm, my family's legacy, was nothing more than a stubborn weed she was waiting to rip out of the ground. By morning, my anger had settled into something colder, sharper. If the HOA thought they could push me out with intimidation, they had picked the wrong farmer. I drove straight to Tom Miller, knowing that if anyone could help me prove what was happening, it was him. He sat at his kitchen table, flipping through documents while sipping black coffee, his expression dark. "I've been looking into this," he muttered, sliding a stack of papers toward me. "Turns out, you're not the only one. Bill Thompson, the Carsons, even the Miller family up the road, every single one of them got a letter like yours." I flipped through the documents, my stomach twisting. Every farm in the area was being targeted. Every farmer was given the same 30-day ultimatum. I clenched my jaw. "This isn't about property values," I said, my voice low. "This is a coordinated attack." Tom nodded. "And I think I know why." That's when he introduced me to Jack Wilson, an investigative journalist who had been digging into similar cases. As soon as I sat down with him, I knew we were onto something bigger than just my farm. "This isn't just your HOA," Jack explained, pulling out his laptop. "This has been happening in counties across the state. Same pattern. HOAs file complaints, farmers get hit with impossible restrictions, and when they're forced to sell, the land gets scooped up by private developers." He clicked on a folder labeled Sunrise Development Corporation. My stomach dropped. I knew that name. It was the same real estate firm Sarah's husband, James Matthews, ran. Jack continued. "Sunrise buys up the land dirt cheap, gets it rezoned, and within months, there's a brand new subdivision sitting on top of what used to be a family farm." He scrolled through a list of names. "It's the same people every time. Sarah Matthews. James Matthews. A handful of corrupt county officials who fast-track zoning approvals. It's a land grab, Ethan. And you're their final target." My hands curled into fists. It wasn't just my farm. They were planning to erase an entire way of life. And then came the next blow. That afternoon, a man in a crisp suit knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Mark Daniels, a private investor interested in my property. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said smoothly, sliding a folder onto my table. 3 times the market value. Cash. No strings attached. I didn't even look at the papers. I leaned back, arms crossed. "Who do you work for?" Mark gave me a practiced smile. "I represent private buyers looking for promising investment properties." I picked up the folder and flipped to the last page. There, buried in the fine print, was the real answer. Sunrise Development Corporation. I let the folder drop onto the table. "Tell your boss I'm not selling." Mark's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. "Ethan, this is a generous offer. You can leave this behind, start fresh somewhere new. Or you can stay, but I promise you, this development is happening with or without your cooperation." I stood up, staring him down. "Get off my property." For the first time, Mark hesitated. He adjusted his tie, grabbed his folder, and left without another word. But I knew what the message was. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a warning, asterisk asterisk. And then, just when I thought I'd seen the worst of it, I got a call from Maggie Johnson. Her voice was shaking. "Ethan. I think you need to come over." When I arrived at her house, she was standing on her porch, holding a stack of papers in her trembling hands. "They're forging signatures," she whispered. She handed me a letter, one of the so-called official complaints the HOA had used against me. At the bottom was her name. Her signature. But she swore she'd never written it. I flipped through the stack. Every single complaint was a fraud. The HOA had been fabricating neighborhood support, forging names, and using those fake documents to justify their campaign against my farm. The worst part? They had already done this to other families, some had already left. Others had been forced out before they even realized what was happening. I felt the weight of it settle in my chest. This wasn't just about me anymore. If we didn't stop them now, they'd keep going. More farms would disappear. More families would lose everything. That night, I sat in my truck, staring out at my land, the place my grandfather had built with his own hands. They thought they could take it from me. They were dead wrong. It was time to stop playing defense. It was time to fight back. I didn't waste any time. The next morning, I gathered Tom Miller, Bill Thompson, and a few other farmers at my place. I laid everything out, the fake complaints, the poisoned water, the secret land deals. Tom's face darkened as he flipped through the forged documents. "This isn't just unethical," he muttered, "it's criminal." Bill's daughter, Rebecca Thompson, a lawyer, had already started digging into Sunrise Development's past deals. What she found was worse than we imagined. They had been running this scheme for years, using corrupt county officials to fast-track zoning changes, pressuring farmers out with bogus HOA fines, then flipping the land into high-end neighborhoods. But the most damning discovery? The same names kept appearing: Sarah Matthews, James Matthews, and the county zoning board. It was an organized land grab, and we finally had the proof to stop them. But just as we were piecing everything together, the HOA made their most desperate move yet. It was nearly midnight when I woke to the sound of rumbling engines outside. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but when I heard the distinct clank of metal against wood, I bolted upright. Something was wrong. I grabbed my rifle and rushed outside. That's when I saw them. A bulldozer, 2 construction trucks, and a group of workers, standing in the glow of headlights right next to my barn. Rage surged through me as I realized what was happening. They were going to tear my barn down. I stormed forward, shouting, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The workers hesitated, but one of them, a man in a hard hat, pulled out a stack of papers. "Emergency demolition order," he said, trying to sound official. "This structure has been deemed unsafe by the HOA." The HOA didn't have that kind of power. I ripped the papers from his hands, scanning them fast. Sarah Matthews had forged an official county notice, declaring my barn abandoned and hazardous and authorizing immediate removal. I clenched my fists. She had skipped every legal step and was trying to erase my farm, overnight, before I could stop her. Not on my watch. I stepped between the bulldozer and my barn, standing firm. "You touch that building, and I'll have every one of you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property." The workers hesitated, looking at each other. They weren't HOA members, they were just doing a job. But before they could decide whether or not to listen, headlights flashed down my driveway, a truck pulled up fast, then another, and another. Within minutes, half the farmers in town were there, standing beside me. Bill. Tom. Rebecca. Even Maggie Johnson, ***. The hard hat guy paled. I think we should call our boss." I crossed my arms. "Yeah, you do that." Sarah showed up 15 minutes later, her Mercedes screeching to a stop in front of my gate. She stepped out, livid, her phone clutched in her perfectly manicured hand. "You are violating a legally sanctioned order," she snapped. "Get out of the way." Tom chuckled beside me, arms crossed. "That's funny. Because I just got off the phone with the county commissioner. And according to him, this order doesn't exist." Sarah's face turned white. Rebecca held up her phone. "And I just sent screenshots of this forged document to the local news. Should be an interesting morning for you, Sarah." For the first time, she looked rattled. She opened her mouth to argue, but then her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and I saw the fear flicker in her eyes. Something was happening. Something she hadn't planned for, ***. As if on cue, Maggie Johnson, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "You forged my name," she said, voice shaking with anger. You lied about those complaints. You tried to steal my neighbor's land. And you know what? I just got off the phone with the county too. I narrowed my eyes. And? Maggie took a slow breath, then lifted her chin. There's an emergency town meeting scheduled for tomorrow night. And the county's opening a formal investigation into you, Sarah. The moment hung heavy in the air. Sarah was silent, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel, marched back to her car, and sped off into the night. The farmers erupted into cheers, but I didn't celebrate. Not yet. I knew Sarah. She wasn't done fighting. And sure enough, the next morning, I got my final warning. A sleek, black SUV pulled into my driveway. James Matthews, he stepped out, flanked by two high-priced lawyers in expensive suits. He adjusted his cufflinks as he strolled toward me, his expression calm, calculating. "Ethan," he said smoothly, "let's cut the theatrics. Name your price." I crossed my arms. "Not for sale." His jaw tightened. "Ethan, listen to me. You can leave this behind, take the money, and live comfortably somewhere else. Or you can stay and make this harder than it has to be. But one way or another, this development is happening." I could feel the weight of every farmer who had lost their land before me. The ones who didn't have the money, the resources, the fight left in them to resist. But I wasn't them. And I wasn't backing down, asterisk asterisk. I stepped forward, meeting his cold gaze. "Then you're going to have to try a hell of a lot harder." Before he could respond, more trucks started pulling up, farmers. Neighbors. Even some of the new homeowners who had started realizing what was happening. They lined up behind me, standing together. James took it all in, his confidence wavering. Then, out of nowhere, another car screeched to a stop, asterisk asterisk Sarah, asterisk asterisk she stormed out, eyes frantic, gripping James's arm. "We have a problem," she hissed, her voice low. And that's when I knew. It was over. Because while James had been trying to bribe me, something else was happening. At that very moment, the county commissioners were holding their emergency meeting, and on the big screen? Security footage of Sarah and James's late-night meetings. The voice recordings from the forged complaints. Every single dirty deal they had made, asterisk asterisk. James paled. He looked at me, then at Sarah. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his SUV. Sarah wasn't so graceful. She let out a frustrated, furious scream before stomping back to her car and tearing down my driveway like a bat out of hell. But it didn't matter. Because her empire was already burning. The fallout was immediate. By the next morning, Sarah and James Matthews had disappeared from town, but it didn't matter. The damage was already done, to them. News stations picked up the story like wildfire. Local HOA caught in farmland scheme flashed across TV screens, alongside footage from the emergency meeting. Videos of their secret land deals, the forged documents, and their blatant attempts to drive farmers out went viral. Then came the real reckoning. 2 days later, state investigators raided the HOA office. Boxes of documents, hard drives, even Sarah's personal laptop, everything was confiscated. And right in the middle of it all? Sarah Matthews herself, led out in handcuffs. The charges? Fraud, conspiracy, and falsifying official documents. But she wasn't the only one. James Matthews was arrested that afternoon at his corporate office. Turns out, his crimes went far beyond my farm, corrupt land deals, money laundering, bribery. His entire real estate empire had been built on deception. Sunrise development was finished. As for the HOA, it collapsed overnight. With Sarah gone and most of the board members resigning, the remaining members had no choice but to dissolve it completely. The new HOA president? Maggie Johnson, the same woman whose forged signature had exposed Sarah's lies. Her first order of business? Tearing up every single restriction against agricultural properties. Standing in front of a cheering crowd, she declared, "This is farm country, and it's going to stay that way." But the fight didn't just stop with our town. Lawmakers took notice. Within weeks, they introduced the Heritage Farm Protection Act, a new law preventing HOAs and developers from forcing generational farmers out of their land. And to think, it all started with one farmer refusing to move his cows. A few weeks later, our small town became the center of something bigger than we ever imagined. Reporters kept showing up, farmers from other counties came just to shake our hands, even the state attorney general paid a visit. Standing in the same spot where Sarah Matthews once waved her fake violations in my face, he addressed the crowd. This case exposed one of the largest land grab schemes in state history. And it all unraveled because this community refused to back down. The fallout spread beyond our town. Developers connected to Sunrise were being scrutinized, county officials who had fast-tracked zoning approvals resigned, and some even faced legal charges. And the best part? Even the new homeowners, people Sarah claimed wanted us gone, stood with us. One of them shook my hand and said, "We moved out here because we wanted to live near real farms, not another soulless subdivision." In the end, even the land Sarah had planned to turn into luxury estates was repurposed into something better, a community farmers market. The same land she tried to steal was now being used to support local farmers and families. As for me, every morning, I still walk my fence line, just like my grandfather did. The cows are still here, grazing peacefully, just as they always have. And every morning, I remind myself of what we fought for. It wasn't just about keeping the farm. It was about keeping a way of life. Sarah and James Matthews thought they could bully a stubborn farmer into giving up his heritage. Instead, they united an entire community and changed state law. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.